everyone, and welcome to today's STERIS Tech Talk on design requirements for Luer connectors. STERIS Tech Talks are a series of webinars covering subjects relating to gas and radiation sterilization processing and the laboratory testing and validation services which support these processes. My name is Ashley Marut, and I'm the Associate Product Manager for STERIS Applied Sterilization Technologies. I'll be the host for today's event. Our presenter today is Phil Roxby. Phil is the Technical Services Manager for STERIS Galway in Ireland. Starting as a mechanical engineer, Phil has held various technical positions within the organization over the last 15 years. His current role involves management of the cross-discipline technical services team responsible for medical device verification and validation testing, test method validation, new test introduction, and process improvement. Other industries served include pharma, automotive, and electronics. All attendees are on mute for the presentation. However, we would like to encourage everyone to submit questions using the questions function on the GoToWebinar control panel. Questions will be answered following the presentation. Today's presentation will be recorded and uploaded to our STERIS Applied Sterilization Technologies YouTube channel. Please note that continuing education credits are not provided as part of this webinar. And now over to Phil to begin the presentation.
Thanks, Ashley. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're listening from. Thank you for joining me. I will give a quick overview today on STERIS and the Galway lab where I'm based. I'll continue to discuss the various Luer design options available to medical device designers and provide an overview on how to comply with the ISO 80369 series of requirements. I'll also touch on some of the updates that came through last month in the edition 2 of 80369 part 7. So as mentioned earlier, I'm based in Galway, Ireland. Galway site, the Galway STERIS site, joined the STERIS AST group in 2018. STERIS AST has over 50 locations worldwide, offering contract sterilization, laboratory testing, and technical support services. We are about 42 staff here in Galway, and our primary offering is medical device and sterile packaging testing and technical services in relation to those tests. We have over 60 test standards on our ISO scope of accreditation, and the main industry served are medical device and pharmaceutical, with an additional electronic reliability laboratory based on site. We differ from quite a lot of traditional packaging and device labs in that we offer both services under one roof, which logistically helps and provides a smoother transition between packaging and product studies. Additionally, we provide technical solutions in relation to product tests, and these typically are in the form of tailored test method developments and test method validations. These projects enable our customers to outsource some, if not all, of their product testing, with the option to bring validated test methods back to their labs once the project is complete. The majority of our customers are based in Europe. However, we do have a number of clients in the US. So I'll start from the beginning. I'm working off the assumption that most of you know what a Luer connector is, but by putting this presentation together some time ago, I did learn a couple of things. So by definition, or certainly by ISO definition, a Luer is a medical device small bore connector which is used for intravascular and hypodermic application. The design dates back to the 1800s, and the overall concept of design has remained relatively unchanged. The purpose of these connectors is to provide a leak-proof, in-line connection for fluids or gases in a healthcare setting. The connectors are designed to maintain a secure yet detachable connection that cannot be misconnected with other connectors So ISO 80369-7 gives a number of options to designers on the type of Luer fitting that can be used. Here are the most popular designs. They are typically broken down into two forms: a threaded lock connector, which can be seen on the top row, and a slip connector, which has no threaded feature. The top left is the female Luer lock. This would be by far the most common style of connector we see in our laboratory. They are commonplace on the hubs of intravascular catheters and delivery systems, and also the common needle. The next connector is a male lock connector, which differs slightly from the male rotating collar lock connector, both of which are commonplace on syringes, inflators, tubing sets, valves, and caps. These connectors are designed to interface and link seamlessly. Additionally, they can also mate with the slip connectors shown at the bottom here. So on the left, we have a female slip connector and a male slip connector. These are far less common these days, where the lock connectors are generally the most popular design to employ. So misconnection is the big risk around use of medical connectors. Back in 2007, the WHO recognized risks in relation to unintentional connection of connectors. The FDA recorded a series of associated patient deaths as a result of misconnection, with many of these cases occurring due to the connection of air supplies to IV lines. This usually resulted in a fatal air embolism or a blockage in the vessel caused by the lodging of air. To address this risk, a working group was formed, and this group developed a series of connectors for various applications in a healthcare setting, including the Luer connector. The intention for the design of these connectors was that the various geometries used engineered out, for the most part, the risk of misconnection. These connector styles or designs feature in the 80369 series of ISO standards. The bottom row here shows the different applications, some of which have not yet been developed, such as the gas connectors and urological, but enteral, limb cuff, neuroaxial, and today's discussed Luer fittings are all in use. Additionally, 80369 Part 1 must be complied with, as these are the general requirements for all connectors, and -20 is employed to provide details of how the test methods detailed in each of these individual standards are performed. I'll note that Part 7, which we're speaking about today, has been revised to Edition 2 just recently, and I'll provide a slide in a little while to discuss the changes. With the release of Edition 2 of Part 7, the FDA treat this standard as the recognized consensus standard for submission. That said, if you're working towards Edition 1, it will be accepted up until 2022. It should also be noted that ISO 594, which is the legacy standard from the 80s and 90s, it will also be accepted all the way up to 2023, which changes things slightly in relation to the qualification of your Luer connector, and I'll speak about the differences in a little while. If CE mark is being sought in Europe, the latest version of 80369 Part 7 and Part 1 are considered state-of-the-art. ISO 594 is no longer recognized. So the key differences between 594 and 80369 Part 7 lie in the dimensional verification requirements and material compliance requirements, which are now required for 80369. Both standards contain a sequence of performance tests which are similar, however, they are not interchangeable. So with the release of 80369 Part 7 a couple of years ago, a new fluid and air leakage test technique was brought forward. Additionally, the method for evaluating the stress cracking test, which again I'll speak about in a little while, was updated, and tighter test parameters were dictated across all performance tests. 594 detailed two tests that were not brought forward and were dropped. These are the gauging tests and the ease of assembly tests. Gauging was replaced with dimensional or non-interconnectability testing. By proving that your Luer connector meets the requirements of 80369 Part 7, you are proving that your connector cannot be misconnected with other connectors in this standard series. There are 15 or so angles and dimensions that need to be verified, and these include checks along the tapered region of the Luer connector and the threaded region. One note is that some of the tolerances have been tightened in the recent Edition 2 of 80369 Part 7, and these are related to rigid connectors. The second shift is towards a material compliance requirement. Now, with 80369 Part 7, the Luer connector must have a minimum flexural or elastic modulus of 700 megapascals. They have also cleared up on what exactly a semi-rigid material is and what a rigid material is with the flexural modulus is detailed on this slide. Compliance with this material requirement can either be performed through, or can be determined through test or through reference of a material data sheet. Finally, performance requirements. These are a sequence of mechanical tests performed on the Luer connector with associated reference gauge connectors. There are 6 mechanical tests required to prove compliance with the Luer lock connector, and 4 tests required to prove a Luer slip connector. And while on the surface these tests appear to be very similar to the tests performed in ISO 594, compliance to ISO 594 does not suffice the full requirements of 80369. So testing typically needs to be repeated. So I'll get into the 6 test methods that are detailed. But before every test, the first step is to assemble the connector under test with a reference gauge connector. So in the images here, you can see a representative Luer connector and a reference gauge. So this would be a female Luer lock connector and a male reference gauge. The test standard dictates which reference gauge is required. Typically for each Luer type, there are 2 reference gauges. Depending on the test being performed, the standard will point to reference gauge A or reference gauge B. So the tricky part here is that these 2 components, the gauge and the connector, must be assembled with a simultaneous axial load and torque. And this needs to be applied at the same time. We use a test rig shown here on the left. And this test rig has a series of weights that can be used and a torque sensor located on the top. The reference gauge is inserted into the jig, and the test technician assembles the Luer fitting into the connector while applying a torque and an axial load. So the first test on the sequence, and actually before I start into each test, it's important to note that we recommend that samples are provided, fresh samples are provided for each test method. So we have 6 test methods here, and if your sample size is 29, we recommend 6 by 29 samples are used to perform the testing. Stacking of testing is not required by the standard, and it does not provide a true representation of the test requirements. So the first test is a pressure test, positive pressure test. With 80369 Part 7, you have the option of 2 pressure tests: the air leakage decay method and the liquid leakage falling drop method. We typically recommend the pressure decay method as it is a variable test method. How the test is performed: the connector under test is assembled with the reference connector. It is then occluded and pressurized with air. The pressure is monitored over 15 to 20 seconds, and the pressure decay rate is calculated. And the test requirement is that it must be below this dictated decay rate. The alternative option here, being the liquid leakage test method, is a similar method. However, water is used rather than air to pressurize the sample. And instead of measuring the pressure drop, this is a visual check, and the sample is assessed for falling drops of liquid from the interface. The next test that is required is the vacuum test, or also known as the sub-atmospheric pressure air leakage test. Again, the part under test is connected to a reference connector. It is occluded and a vacuum is applied. The vacuum pressure is measured over 15 to 20 seconds, and again, the pressure decay rate is calculated. This too is a variable test. The third test is the stress cracking test. This test starts in the same way with step 1 as I described earlier. The reference fitting and connector are left assembled for 48 hours in a controlled environment. Once this time has elapsed, the part is brought forward for leakage testing as described in the previous test, and the pressure decay rate is calculated and assessed against the standard acceptance criteria. We often get asked by our customers, do we need to perform the pressure test both after stress cracking and in isolation in a separate test? And we have confirmed with the ISO committee that yes, you do need to perform both tests. Again, this is a variable test. The next test in the sequence is the axial load test. This test is similar to a tensile test, where the reference fitting and Luer connector are assembled, and the assembly is placed in a tensile test machine. A load of 20 to 30 newtons is applied and held for 10 to 15 seconds. To pass this test, the two connectors must not separate. This is an attribute test. Finally, the remaining two tests are the unscrewing tests and the overriding test. The unscrewing test involves assembly of the connectors and then an application of an counterclockwise or an unscrewing torque to the connector. This torque is slightly lower than the assembly torque, and to pass this test, the samples must not unscrew. And finally, the overriding test. Very similar to the unscrewing test, but in this case, a clockwise torque is applied, so in a tightening direction. This torque is higher than the assembly torque, and it is held for 5 to 10 seconds. The connectors are then checked for thread slippage or stripping. As you can see, a sample that failed the overriding test is shown here on the right. Both of these tests are attribute tests. And finally, I mentioned previously that edition 2 of ISO 80369 part 7 has been released. The updates, the most notable updates, are revised torque values for the aforementioned resistance to separation from unscrewing test. There are now dimensional requirements for both rigid and semi-rigid materials, where before there was only one dimensional requirement. The specs for rigid connectors have tightened. Secondly, in relation to male Luer lock connectors, the requirement of dimension T has been dropped. It is now referred to as an auxiliary dimension, which is a dimension derived from other dimensions and is given for information purposes only. Finally, there has been suggested changes to the reference fittings used for test. Luckily, there is mention of the acceptable use of the older connectors. So if you have some Luer test capability already in-house, this should not impact you.
Awesome. Thank you, Phil, for sharing your knowledge and expertise. This concludes the presentation portion of today's webinar.